Lord, your people praise you. You dwell in the praises, worship, and adoration of your people. Today, we continue our worship by listening to your word. As we turn our attention to what you want to tell us, we come before your word with humble hearts. Speak to us today through the message you have given. Open our ears to hear what you are saying to us. Our reading today comes from Matthew chapter 5. One of the Beatitudes says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." Jesus also teaches, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not murder.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." He goes on to say that if you are about to offer your gift to God and remember that someone has something against you, first go and make peace with that person, then come and offer your gift. The title of today's message is, When Law Meets Grace, When the Old Meets the New. Today we will be talking about anger, conflict, and even murder. As we look around the world, many people are hoping for an end to violence and conflict. Yet Jesus teaches us that conflict does not begin on the battlefield. It begins in the human heart. The Sermon on the Mount helps us understand the roots of conflict and shows us a better way to live. We will discover the amazing blessings that come when law meets grace. Many believers struggle with this question. How do law and grace fit together? We want to honor God's law, but we also want to walk in the grace that Jesus brings. Why was the law given? The law was a temporary solution for sin. It required continual sacrifices. Animals were offered again and again. There seemed to be no end to the sacrifices. God gave the law to Moses, and it was written on stone tablets. People followed it because God commanded it. But then grace came. Grace is God's eternal solution for sin. Through Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross, a complete and everlasting answer was provided. Grace came through Jesus. We receive it through faith, and when we receive Christ, we are saved. The Beatitudes show us what life looks like when God's work begins inside us. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek." Again and again we hear the word blessed. This is very different from the law. The law focused on commands, rules, and requirements. Grace brings transformation from the inside out. The law was written on stone. Grace is written on the heart. As Christ lives in us, he begins to write his ways into our hearts and spirits. We become more like Jesus, not simply because we are following rules, but because his life is working within us. As we continue, we see the known Old Testament law meeting the unknown New Testament grace. Jesus begins by saying, "You have heard that it was said to those of old." He takes his listeners back to the sixth commandment, "You shall not murder." The people knew the law. That was all they had known for generations. Jesus starts where they are familiar and then leads them into something greater. The law contained many commands, but it could never fully solve the problem of sin. It required ongoing sacrifices and constant effort. Jesus came to bridge the gap. He became the way from the old covenant into the new covenant. At that moment, many people did not fully understand what grace would mean, but they were drawn to Jesus. They saw his compassion. They experienced his healing. They heard words of blessing instead of endless rules. Jesus was offering something deeper. He was offering a transformed life, a life filled with God's blessing. And that same invitation is available to us today. Every one of us is on a journey of understanding how law and grace work together. As we follow Jesus, we learn what it means to live fully in his grace. Now, let's look more closely at the sixth commandment. Some Bible translations, especially the King James Version, say, "Thou shalt not kill." Because of that wording, some people assume the commandment forbids all killing, but the original Hebrew language tells us something important. The Hebrew word does not mean kill. It means murder. There is a significant difference. To kill can mean taking any life, whether human or animal. It can happen intentionally or accidentally. It can be legal or illegal. But murder means something much more specific. Murder is the unlawful and immoral taking of a human life. For example, we might say someone accidentally killed another person. We would not say they accidentally murdered someone. Likewise, we kill insects or animals, but we do not murder them. So why did older Bible translations use the word kill? Because 400 years ago, when the King James Version was translated, the English word kill was often used with the same meaning as murder. Over time, the meaning of the word changed. As a result, many modern readers misunderstand the commandment. The clearest understanding is, "You shall not murder." But Jesus does not stop there. He takes the commandment deeper. He teaches that murder begins long before a life is taken. It starts with anger. It starts with bitterness. It starts with hatred in the heart. And that is where true transformation must begin. But before we look at what Jesus says about anger, let's clear up a common misunderstanding about the sixth commandment. So why did the King James Bible use the word kill instead of murder? The answer is simple. 400 years ago, when the King James Version was translated, the English word kill often meant the same thing as murder. Over the centuries, the English language changed. Today, the word kill has a much broader meaning. Because of that, some people mistakenly believe that the sixth commandment forbids all killing, but that cannot be what the commandment means. If God had forbidden all killing, then people would not be allowed to eat animals. Animal sacrifices, which were commanded in the Old Testament, would have been prohibited. Even defending yourself or protecting others from harm would not be permitted. But before we look at what Jesus says about anger, let's clear up a common misunderstanding about the sixth commandment. So why did the King James Bible use the word kill instead of murder? The answer is simple. 400 years ago, when the King James Version was translated, the English word kill often meant the same thing as murder. Over the centuries, the English language changed. Today, the word kill has a much broader meaning. Because of that, some people mistakenly believe that the sixth commandment forbids all killing. But that cannot be what the commandment means. If God had forbidden all killing, then people would not be allowed to eat animals. Animal sacrifices, which were commanded in the Old Testament, would have been prohibited. Even defending yourself or protecting others from harm would not be permitted. The Bible itself shows us that the commandment is specifically about murder. In the same books of the Bible that contain the Ten Commandments, we find laws about capital punishment for murder, instructions regarding warfare, regulations for animal sacrifices, and permission to eat meat. All of these things make it clear that the commandment is not saying do not kill. It is saying do not murder. Understanding this correctly is very important. Today, nearly all modern Bible translations use the word murder because it accurately reflects the original meaning of the Hebrew text. When we misunderstand this commandment, we can end up building beliefs on something the Bible never actually teaches. But Jesus is about to take us even deeper. He is not only concerned with the outward act of murder. He wants us to examine the heart, because murder does not begin with a weapon. It begins with anger. It begins with bitterness. It begins with resentment that is left unchecked. And this is where Jesus takes the conversation beyond the law and into grace. The 10 Commandments were not given randomly. They form a foundation for a healthy and just society. They help preserve moral values, justice, freedom, and social order. When one commandment is broken, it often leads to the breaking of others. God's commands were designed to protect people and guide them toward a life that honors Him. But Jesus came to do more than simply give rules. He came to transform hearts. The law can tell us what is wrong. Grace gives us the power to become what God calls us to be. The law says, do not murder. Jesus says, do not let anger take root in your heart. The law focuses on actions. Grace transforms the person, and that is the beauty of the gospel. Jesus does not merely change our behavior. He changes us from the inside out. The 10 Commandments were not given as random rules. They were given in a specific order, with each commandment helping to protect the next. When one commandment is broken, others often follow. Together, they form the moral foundation that supports freedom, justice, and order in society. It is interesting that many of the commandments begin with the words, you shall not. They tell us what to avoid, but they also point us toward a better way of living. As we return to Matthew chapter 5, we see how Jesus brings law and grace together. We have already looked at the commandment, you shall not murder. We now understand that murder means the intentional and unlawful taking of human life. But Jesus does not stop there. Grace takes us deeper. Jesus says, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. He continues, whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the fire of hell. At first, these words may seem surprising. How can anger, insults, and harsh words be placed alongside murder? Because Jesus is revealing something important. God does not only look at our actions, He also looks at our hearts. The law focuses on what we do. Grace exposes why we do it. Murder is not simply an act that happens in a moment. It often begins much earlier. It begins with anger that is allowed to grow. It begins with bitterness that is never dealt with. It begins with resentment that takes root in the heart. Jesus is teaching us that the seeds of murder can exist long before any physical act takes place. Every human life is precious because every person is created in the image of God. Life belongs to God. He is the giver of life. And because he is the giver of life, he alone has authority over it. We did not create life. Therefore, we do not have the right to take life according to our own will. There are many questions about life and death that we cannot fully understand. People often ask, why did God allow this person to die? Or why did this tragedy happen? These are difficult questions. Many of us have wrestled with them. But there are things that belong to God's wisdom alone. Life and death are ultimately in his hands. Our understanding is limited, but God's understanding is perfect. That is why Jesus calls us to trust him, even when we do not have all the answers. And that brings us back to the heart of this passage. Jesus is not only concerned with preventing murder, he is concerned with transforming the heart that leads to murder. He wants to remove anger. He wants to heal bitterness. He wants to replace hatred with forgiveness, because true righteousness is not just about what happens on the outside. It begins with what God is doing on the inside. Jesus gives 3 warnings. The first is about anger. He says, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Not all anger is sinful. Jesus himself showed righteous anger when he cleansed the temple. But there is another kind of anger, an anger that grows from pride, jealousy, and selfish desires. We see this in the story of Cain and Abel. When God accepted Abel's offering but rejected Cain's, Cain became angry. God warned him, sin is crouching at your door. You must rule over it. God was giving Cain a choice. The same choice is before us today. Will we allow anger to control us, or will we surrender it to God? Because unchecked anger can grow into bitterness. And bitterness can eventually destroy relationships, families, and even lives. The law identifies what is wrong. Grace transforms what is wrong. As parents, leaders, and believers, we must learn the difference between punishment and restoration. God's desire is not merely to condemn. His desire is to redeem. Jesus challenged the religious leaders because their hearts had become hardened against God's purposes. Their opposition to God's truth eventually led them to reject and seek to kill the very Messiah they were waiting for. The lesson is clear. When anger becomes a settled attitude of the heart, it can lead us away from God's will. Jesus continues, whoever insults his brother will be liable to judgment. Words matter. Many relationships have been damaged not by physical violence but by constant criticism, insults, and contempt. The tongue has the power of life and death. Our words can build people up or tear them down. Jesus then gives a third warning. Whoever says, you fool, will be liable to judgment. Why is this so serious? Because every person is created in the image of God. When we treat people as worthless, we are denying the value God has placed on them. Jesus is teaching us that murder begins long before a physical act. It begins with attitudes of contempt, disrespect, and hatred. Instead of anger, choose love. Instead of insults, choose encouragement. Instead of contempt, choose mercy. This is what grace looks like. Grace transforms our relationships. Grace changes how we speak. Grace changes how we treat others. Jesus traces murder back to its roots. Not only violence, not only actions, but the condition of the heart. And that is where true change begins. So what should we do? Jesus gives a practical answer. If you are worshiping God and remember that there is conflict between you and another person, go and seek reconciliation. Make peace. Restore the relationship. Then return and offer your worship. God wants us to be peacemakers, not peacekeepers. Peacemakers. People who actively bring healing where there is division. People who choose forgiveness instead of revenge. People who choose grace instead of bitterness. God has given every believer a ministry of reconciliation. That calling begins in our homes. It extends to our workplaces, it reaches our communities, and it touches everyone around us. Grace wins. Grace overcomes hatred. Grace overcomes anger. Grace overcomes division. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. If you have experienced rejection, anger, hurt, or broken relationships, remember this. Jesus was rejected so that you could be accepted. Jesus offers forgiveness where there is guilt, peace where there is conflict, hope where there is despair, and through his grace, what is broken can be made whole again. If this message encouraged you today, please consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps these videos reach more people who may need hope, encouragement, and God's word in their lives. Feel free to share this message with someone who might be blessed by it. Thank you for being part of this community, and may God bless you abundantly.